Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And this is our first episode of the new year, 2022. And it's a really great pleasure and privilege to be joined by Andrew Heyn, who served, of course, as British Consul General in Hong Kong from 2016 to 2020. So I think you left Hong Kong just slightly over a year ago. And of course, previously served as ambassador to Burma or Myanmar. So Andy, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for joining.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Ben. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much. Well, perhaps I could start by asking, you went to Hong Kong in 2016. When you look back at Hong Kong when you first arrived at that time and Hong Kong today, what are your reflections? And perhaps I could add to that, where does it leave the Sino-British Joint Declaration, the whole basis of the handover of Hong Kong?
Well, I mean, it was remarkable, the difference between the 4 years. Just sort of taking it globally, first of all, I got there in September of 2016, so we just had the Brexit vote in the UK, and the American election was pending and imminent. That's more than pending, and the relationship at that point between the UK and Hong Kong was a pretty good one. There were difficulties, there were some real issues where we were concerned about what we looked on as a risk of a gradual erosion of the Joint Declaration and the undertakings that were given by the Chinese side in the Joint Declaration. But in general, the relationship was a positive one. We had a good through flow of ministerial visits. We had a lot of commercial business going on. Of course, all the other cultural and touristic links were thriving. And frankly, the biggest concern I had when I went out to Hong Kong was whether the inward investment situation was going to be affected by the vote on Brexit. How would Hong Kong investors react? And in fact, the answer to that was not particularly badly. They were okay with it. If you then fast forward to my departure in 2020, things had got into a really adversarial relationship between the UK and China on Hong Kong, and actually between the UK and the Hong Kong administration. So just as an illustration of how things were, from a diplomat's perspective, having had, phone access, pick up the phone, have a meeting with the chief executive or with any of the bureau secretaries, and the answer would be yes, just it was a question of the timing. It was becoming like mainland China in terms of, meetings were very difficult to get. And in fact, there was quite a big question about whether I would get a farewell call on the chief executive. Now that did happen, but that was an illustration of diplomatically how bad it got. Now, the reason for all that is well known, the protests in 2019 and then the introduction of the national security law in 2020 and I'm sure we'll touch on lots of the implications of that. But the weather had changed just from the day, it changed from night to day, or day to night, probably more accurately during my time there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned the 2019 protests. Would you describe that as the sort of the key turning point, or did you see it coming? Did you see the extradition law? Did you see the public reaction? Did you anticipate any of that?
We did. I think pretty much. Living in Hong Kong as a diplomat, clearly I was, and my colleagues were, you could sense the degree of anger and a degree of bewilderment, and in almost equal measure on why this was being done. And the anger was very much focused on the Hong Kong administration. And it wasn't clear at the beginning whether this was, the speculation really was about, had Beijing ordered this? Or was this something which the Hong Kong administration took upon themselves to do? And I think most people now would conclude, as I did, that it was the latter, that this was something that the current chief executive decided to do. It was clearly, it was mishandled at so many different levels that it's difficult to know quite where to start. But what I don't think any of us anticipated was quite how strongly people felt. We knew you couldn't fail to pick up directly or through osmosis how angry people were about this legislation. and what it meant. But the scale of the protest, I think, caught us all by surprise.
Absolutely. And were you, do you think with hindsight, Carrie Lam, the Hong Kong government, or Beijing could have done things differently? I mean, there were various junctures during the protests against the extradition law before things turned violent, before there was both police brutality and some violence on the part of protesters, where she could have handled things differently. And even, of course, later in the year, the district council elections potentially provided an opportunity for a rethink on the part of the government. None of that happened. Why do you think that was?
I think, of course, things could have been handled differently. And I'm sure if Carrie Lam were to look back, and she's kind of said this publicly, you know, if I'd known, you know, I messed it up. The problem was that it took her so long to get from I'm doing it to I'm a little bit sorry to I've messed it up, that, you know, the protest grew. I mean, my sense is that these were coming, and whether it had been the extradition law or the draft bill, that lit the touch paper. But the touch paper was there, and it was what I saw during my time. You talked about earlier on the early time followed by the time that I left. And what became clear to me, which hadn't been clear to me before I got to Hong Kong, was there was this sort of fundamental disconnect between what the UK saw, and the UK and the West saw as what the Joint Declaration meant, and what Beijing saw as what the Joint Declaration meant. And thus, you know, up until 2019, I suppose, that had just about been okay. We'd seen, you know, it wasn't the first protest, as you say, but that hadn't really started to be as what Beijing would see, I think, as an existential threat to their sovereignty of Hong Kong. And I'm not sure the protests were either, but there we are. But this sort of difference of view, which I think for a shorthand, I always kind of look at it as where we saw it as one country, two systems, the Chinese saw it as one country, two economic systems. And that's why I think the economic pillar of the Joint Declaration has largely survived. It's a little bit different how it was, but I think that the tensions in those two positions were getting increasingly difficult to manage. So the extradition bill was what brought it on, but my sense is something would have done. It might have happened 5 years from now. It might have happened tomorrow. I don't know, but I get the sense it was coming.
Yeah. I think I'm right in saying that although hundreds of protesters, including many peaceful protesters, were arrested, prosecuted, and jailed, no one in the police has been held accountable for the really, I mean, I wasn't there on the ground, but watching from here, what seemed like really disproportionate, indiscriminate, shocking violence by the police. What efforts did you and the UK government make to try, albeit of course without success, but to try to get the Hong Kong government to look at the question of impunity for police violence and some accountability?
Yeah, well, you've done it. It's absolutely right to focus on that, because as the protests grew, and there were the 5 demands, I mean, the withdrawal of the bill was right up there. Of course, that happened. And then it became, you know, there were various different demands, but the desire and, you know, the clamor for an independent inquiry into how the police had behaved during the protests. And, you know, we should be clear, there were people on both sides who broke the law, but the police, certainly some of their behavior was well below the standards that you should expect of a professional police force. And we had we pressed hard for this because we could see that for the stability of Hong Kong, which was in everybody's interest, including very much ours, that something needed. You couldn't just let this fester. And there was a partial degree of success. So we pressed very hard for this, and there was a partial degree of success in that the chief executive set up a body which was going to look at. It was within the existing frameworks. To have a look at what happened, and brought in a number of independent experts, from external experts, including 2 from the UK. I forget the name of that group, but essentially it was much heralded, and we in the West, I'll talk about UK policy, but it was generally that we were together as a group, but we in the UK gave a cautious welcome to it because it did have external people on it, credible external people, but we were worried about its terms of reference and what it was going to be able to do, hence the caution and the welcome. And that caution proved very wise, because in the end, both of the UK participants stepped away. They said this is being done in a way that is not credible. And one of them said he wasn't prepared to be part of a fig leaf placed over what had happened. So this issue was never addressed. And I think it was a great shame that it was never addressed, not just because it must be right that if the security forces have overstepped the mark, there is accountability, but also it demonstrated that there was no real interest after a point. There came a point where there was clearly no interest in looking back. It's happened, and now we're going to deal with this problem not happening again. And the national security law eventually became the vehicle for that.
Well, turning to the national security law, what in your assessment has been the impact of the national security law? What has it done to Hong Kong?
I think it's closed down the political space in a way that is so fundamental, it's quite hard to find the right description of it. But I'm thinking of, again, let's perhaps do a quick contrast of going back into the Hong Kong that I went to in 2016, which had been largely the Hong Kong that had been since handover. And you had opposition politicians who were very critical of the government and were ran for election. We had one or two disqualifications, as you will recall, these were some of the straws in the wind I was talking about earlier. Is this the beginning of the erosion of political freedoms? But the space for opposition has now been all but eliminated. So this current LegCo is clearly a rubber stamping organization. I'm sure they will criticize the government from time to time, but the Hong Kong government, but it certainly won't go anywhere near arguing for human rights, democracy, all of those things, fundamental freedoms, which the opposition politicians did when I arrived. The media, we've seen the close down of a number of media outlets. We've seen the Jimmy Lai being imprisoned, so the media space has gone. I would be very worried for my safety if I were an activist in Hong Kong now arguing for some of the things that we've just been talking about. Now, all of that was happening before. That people could do that. They could argue and they could protest. I mean, it was extraordinary. The first week I was there, I remember driving down in the central district of Hong Kong, and the protesters coming from all sides, very peaceful protests, protesting about goodness knows what. But you don't do that anymore. It's almost as if the political life and the space has been sucked out, and what you're left with is a functioning economy. And I imagine Hong Kong is I know it's been hit by the impact of COVID and the mainland being the border being closed, but Hong Kong's economy I'm sure will rebound. But the other things that made Hong Kong and that sort of fundamental freedoms part have gone, and it's hard to see them coming back.
Absolutely. Well, one of the last remaining elements of what had made Hong Kong such a success, that I know about a year ago, you and I spoke, and I spoke with others, and people were still trying to cling on to hope for, was the question of an independent judiciary, and specifically the question of whether or not the foreign judges should remain. A year on from that now, how do you see the question of judicial independence, and whether the foreign judges are still adding strength and courage to the local judges, or whether they're actually now just sort of wallpaper, giving credibility to a system that has lost credibility?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one of the ones I found most difficult to answer. And at one level, you have the law now being used as a vehicle to close down the political space. So if you're looking at the independence, the independence of the judiciary, I think you could certainly argue in some of the prosecutions, that have been brought forward recently. Jimmy Lai is a case in point, some of the opposition politicians. The national security law almost operates outside of the usual judicial framework. You would say, well, that's no longer an independent judiciary. And so the British judges and the foreign judges should, on the Court of Final Appeal, should step away. I think that they are right to still be doing what they're doing, and I'll try to explain that. There are certain parts, as I hope sort of set out, there are certain parts of the judicial framework which are going in a worrying direction. If the judges, but so far, I met most of the foreign judges, all the Brits who came through. I always made a point of meeting them. Their commitment to the rule of law, as you would expect, is absolutely fundamental to them. Their unwillingness, and they would, under no circumstances would they let themselves be used as a fig leaf and to give some sort of credibility to a system that has lost that credibility. They don't do it for the money. They do it because they believe in the rule of law in Hong Kong, and they believe that there is their presence on the court of final appeal acts as a handbrake, whether it's a handbrake or an enabler to strong rule of law. That's the reason that they do it. And I would support them in that. What I think is crucial, and I have absolutely no doubt that this would happen, this hypothetical scenario would unwind the way that I'm about to talk it through. If any one of them felt they had been put under pressure to find a case in a certain way, or a case was being presented in a way that was not consistent with the law, the rule of law, and the systems of law that they had signed up to, they would step down. And my view is it would have much greater impact if they found themselves in that situation, then step down, rather than doing, which must be tempting for them, because, it's not easy for them to do this. They're flying, so I know from personal experience, Hong Kong's a great place, but it's a long flight. They're busy people. It's a disruption in their lives. But they would step away, I think, in a heartbeat if they felt there was any attempt to persuade them to go a certain way, or if they felt that the rule of the case that they were looking at, that the way it was being presented was so distant from the legal rules that they could not do it. And I reckon that would be, for me, it would have much greater, if they, let's say they all just step down now, yes, it would send a signal, no doubt about that, and that, that has its place. But the people most pleased about it would be in Beijing. Getting rid of these pesky meddling foreign judges, it's almost like an insult to their system that they have to have that. So I think they're doing the right thing in not stepping down at this point.
Very interesting. Talking about Beijing, we've just in the last day or so heard the latest news about the appointment of the new commander of People's Liberation Army troops in Hong Kong, having come from being the chief of staff in Xinjiang. What do you read into that?
Well, yeah, I mean, doesn't look like a positive move, does it? I mean, the fact is that, essentially, the key thing that we always used to rally round, as it were, when I was lobbying both the Chinese Foreign Ministry or the Hong Kong administration about, be it the national security law or the disqualification of candidates, or even the refusal of entry to certain activists such as you, Ben, it would be, this Hong Kong was guaranteed a high degree of autonomy, and that decisions that, frankly, were clearly not coming from Hong Kong, but were instead coming from Beijing, that was inconsistent with that, were orders rather than decisions. I mean, what I saw in the last year I was in Hong Kong was that, whereas I mentioned several times this erosion that we felt was happening, and the disqualification of candidates and the refusal of entry to certain people were part of that. But it was like the gloves came off. It was from the national security infrastructure, which was placed in Hong Kong. That was Beijing Central. So this, I think, it's a worrying development, but it's just the latest in a series. And I don't think there's any pretense that Hong Kong has a high degree of autonomy now.
Yeah. Given everything that we've just been discussing, and you touched on Hong Kong's economy earlier, but with the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, autonomy, at least the undermining of the threat to the rule of law, transparency, what does all of that mean for, in terms of business risk? Can Hong Kong continue to be the international trading center that it has been for so long, that businesses had such confidence in?
Yeah, well, again, absolutely the right question. I mean, I think the answer to that is probably yes, it can. And it can because the Chinese economy is so fundamental to the global economy. Hong Kong has this crucial role as an enabler, shall we say, you know, that sort of, people describe it very often as that superconductor between China and the rest of the world. I think I'm quoting C.Y. Leung in that, but anyway, there we are. But that was one of the phrases that was out there. And it is that. And so China needs the Western financial institution or global financial institutions in Hong Kong, and it works for the global financial institutions to be there because of the size of the China market. I suspect that what I saw during my time near the end, from about probably from the protests onwards, was a very different way. Whereas business, you know, if you were to ask a CEO, a regional CEO of a financial institution based in Hong Kong, the changes that he had seen or she had seen from 2016 to 2020, I suspect that the reply would be, it's become a lot more like operating in Beijing. In that, you know, the not so much from the rule of law point of view, but you know, for a start, it's not such an attractive place for expatriates now, not just because of the COVID restrictions, but just because, you know, the way that people are worried about the education system, all the freedoms, you know, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next with the internet in Hong Kong, for example, which is still reasonably free. So what's going to happen to the freedom of the press? So these raise questions about whether the top people want to go to Hong Kong in the future. What I noticed was at the time of the protests, the pressure that was put on international business to line up and support the government. And that was new, that hadn't happened before. Cathay, as you will recall, got their wings very seriously clipped, which is actually quite a good analogy for Cathay, but Cathay faced a really big problem as a result of some of their staff supporting the protests and the management reaction to that. And so there was much more pressure to toe the line. And the same with the national security legislation. So I suspect that in terms of the marriage of convenience that Hong Kong represents between Western business and China as an economy, that marriage is probably still reasonably strong. I just think the way that business will operate there is now much more like operating in Beijing. And again, you know, this is mainly because Beijing is running Hong Kong now.
Yeah, absolutely. You may be aware that Hong Kong Watch, over the course of the last year, published 2 reports that illustrate some of the issues you've raised. One was a report on the influence of what we call red capital, capital associated with Beijing, with the Communist Party regime. And then more recently, a report on the whole question of ESG and human rights and ethical investment, and the fact that a significant number of pension funds Western pension funds are invested in Chinese companies that are complicit with terrible human rights violations. One particular example that sort of straddles both those issues and the issues that you've highlighted, of course, is HSBC, both in terms of its behavior in freezing activist bank accounts, and then the revelations just in the Sunday Times this weekend of its shares in companies in Xinjiang. As a British bank, essentially, albeit with its largest market in China, what can the UK what can and should the UK do about these serious questions about HSBC's ethics?
Well, I think it's absolutely right in the, to raise these issues with the institution concerned. And I was uneasy about some of the things that the Foreign Secretary said about both HSBC and Standard Chartered at the time of the national security law, because both banks were placed in a really difficult situation. Whether they handled it right is another matter, but I think some of the language used there I thought was unwise. And but I do think the fact is that whether you call it ESG, corporate social responsibility, banks are answerable now in a way that they weren't before. And I think that it is, given the UK government's position on human rights, it is would be entirely consistent for ministers to be raising these issues with HSBC, find out what HSBC have to say about it, to be where you go from that beyond pressure. This is something which we think is inconsistent with the standards of an international global bank. Well, that's a matter for the ministers concerned. But I guess the only point I would make is I think it was a, what's the word I'm looking for? It was an easy shot, basically, to bash the banks about a bit when they supported the national security law. At the time I was sitting in Hong Kong, again, I don't know what I would have done had I been the CEO of one of those banks, but I could appreciate the horns of the dilemma they were on in how they played that. Not least, because many of these companies, as you rightly pointed out, their Asia business is absolutely fundamental to them. But that's not an excuse for unethical investment.
Yeah, absolutely. Just turning in a final few questions. Can I ask probably without doubt, the most significant policy response that the UK made following the imposition of the national security law was the introduction of the BNO scheme. A year and a half on, and we've seen significant numbers of Hong Kongers taking it up and coming to the UK, and generally speaking, I think being very welcomed here and settling well. What are your reflections on that?
Well, I think it was exactly the right response, and I was, the government is getting a lot of criticism right now for all sorts of different things, and some of it probably deserves. But on that, I thought it was a remarkable response. It was the right response in that, for all that was thrown by largely the US, who really, as you know, went to town on sanctions, on removing Hong Kong's special trading status. The Trump administration went full out on to respond to what was happening in Hong Kong. That made actually no difference at all to what China did. So, and that, if you look at the pattern of pressure on China, particularly on internal issues, as they would view Hong Kong as being an internal issue, the times that pressure has made a difference are not that many, frankly. Where, I think the West does need to go with China is having a united front on what we do on our watch, on our territory in response to that, be that economic, be it commercial, whatever it may be. And I think this was the scale of that policy shift was huge. And it's very hard to overstate it because it was so fundamental to say, effectively, we are providing a path to citizenship for, the figures are a little bit uncertain, but, 5 million is not unreasonable when you consider that dependents can come as well. So, it was, I thought, the right policy response. The speed with which the Home Office did it was very impressive. And I'm sure there will be teething issues. But what pleased me most was A, that we did it. And secondly, that, faced with various ways in which you could do it, what we ended up with was at the very, the most generous end of the spectrum. And I think that, the government, and the officials, we were advocating for it from our end, of course, But that's the easy bit. It's actually getting it in and getting it done and then delivering it, which has been done. And I think what's not clear yet is how many people will come, because of course COVID is still such a big issue. So I don't think we'll know. Well, let's see where COVID goes. But if it becomes endemic rather than pandemic, then we'll have a better sense in a couple of years' time how many people will leave. But it is, I think, absolutely right that the UK, given its historical link with Hong Kong, did that to offer. Okay, if things get so bad you can't stay, there is somewhere for you to come.
Yeah, absolutely. A penultimate question, just looking at what else both the UK and others could do. I totally agree with you that the BNO scheme was very generous, very, very right, and I really applaud the government for it. But it doesn't, of course, do anything to change the situation on the ground in Hong Kong. It gives Hong Kong as a lifeline out, which is very welcome. You mentioned that you didn't think sanctions had much effect, but at the same time, couldn't one argue that if the regime in Beijing faces no consequences, no price to pay for breaking an international treaty, breaking its promises to Hong Kong, then it will just be emboldened to become even more repressive in Hong Kong, but then also become even more threatening to Taiwan, the South China Sea, and ultimately our own freedoms. And if that is the case, what more can and should the UK and others do together?
Yeah, no, it is one of those issues which I grappled with, knowing, for example, when we were contributing to ministerial briefing, that what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And, so plenty, as you've identified, plenty was done in terms of statements making clear that this was, how this was viewed, the BNO approach, which has been not mirrored, because obviously BNOs are kind of unique, but other countries, part of the Five Eyes group have become more generous in some cases with their immigration policies from Hong Kong. But I agree. I mean, what's going to actually achieve change on the ground? Well, it's profoundly difficult to do that. I think what we are seeing is that the West is getting its act together in a more effective way. It's still, I would like it to be more effective yet, but in making clear that these types of actions that you ran through there, Ben, have consequences. They have consequences commercially. China is now, has very little credibility when it talks about, international law. It's broken an international, binding treaty with the UK. Its saber rattling on Taiwan is completely inconsistent with, they wouldn't see it this way, but I think everybody else outside of China is extremely worried about it and sees it as an unwarranted threat. And so we are starting to get into a more concerted and unified reaction response to what China is doing. But, it is profoundly difficult. And, it's a bit like dealing, with, at the moment, America is the world's largest economy. And so it's a difficult decision, and the world's leading power. It's a difficult decision for a country to say, well, we're going to cut ourselves off from them and we're going to punish them. We have to be realistic about that. But if the West fails to act in unity on China, it will be divided and ruled. And that I think it's happening less so, because my own view is that China has become overly belligerent, and it's become harder for those who argue, tough measures won't work. It's become harder for those people to argue that this idea of dialogue, I suppose, and statements alone is going to be enough. And this is why I think you're seeing companies like Huawei denied access to markets in a way that probably wouldn't have happened back in 2016 when, for example, we had Dave Cameron just left by the time I went out to Hong Kong after the Brexit vote. But the point, that period of the golden era between the UK and China is very different now. And that's just one consequence of what China has done.
Yeah, absolutely. A final question. We're seeing very grim, dark times for Hong Kong at the moment. We're also approaching Chinese New Year, and I imagine, well, I don't imagine, I know as Consul General, you would have given a Chinese New Year message each year. At this time of year now, and given everything we've been talking about, and I'm not asking you to do it in Cantonese, but what message would you have for people watching this about the future for Hong Kong, what they should do? What would you want to say to viewers?
Well, it's a good question. I would, I think, be saying to, assuming I'm addressing my message to the people of Hong Kong, Happy New Year, and Britain has not forgotten about you. And because I know that neither the government nor people who have any influence here have. It is difficult, to know how to turn this around. But I was very struck by one of my Asian colleagues in Hong Kong, and I was getting, as were most of my Five Eyes colleagues, very depressed and down about Hong Kong. And he said, look, Asia's been through such a tumultuous time over the last century, and that's ignoring what's happened before then, but just focus on the last century. What looks like is the norm now may not be the norm in 10, 20 years. Just don't burn all the bridges in the meantime. Mm. And I thought, that you could say that's rather naive optimism, but I thought, there's something in that. And I do think, so I think that's why, in addition to keeping up the pressure and calling things out, keeping the BNO policy, making sure that's working, it's very important to keep the bridges open with Hong Kong, because it's bleak now doesn't mean it always will be. So there's a hopeful New Year message.
Absolutely. Well, we certainly need hopeful messages. So thank you very much, Andy Heyn, for joining us today, for covering a range of issues. And thank you for your time.
No, it's my pleasure.
Thank you.